Hey, it's Ryan Arnold, the night guy here at XRT. We're at Navy Pier, the end near the Grand Ballroom for the Rolling Stones Exhibitionism exhibit. And we're sitting down with Paul Natkin, who for several tours, both the Rolling Stones and some of their solo work, for Keith Richards' solo work, was a tour photographer. He's got a great exhibit. Even before you get up to exhibitionism, you can see a lot of his photographs. You can watch a cool short documentary on him. And that's where we're sitting down right now. And we're going to talk to Paul Natkin about his access to the Rolling Stones. How you doing, Paul?
Doing good. How about you?
Very well. Thanks for taking time. So, just want to get a sense of how you first met the Rolling Stones and then how you got to shoot your first tour.
Well, my next door neighbor was a guy by the name of Don McLeese, who was the music critic of the Chicago Sun-Times. And one day I was taking out my garbage, and he was standing out on his front porch, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to New York tomorrow to interview Keith Richards. Do you want to come with and take pictures?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "Well, go back inside and call the airlines and buy a plane ticket, and we're leaving tomorrow morning." So I bought a plane ticket, went with him to New York, went to Keith's manager's office, and there he was, Keith Richards, my idol, standing there in the flesh. And I took some pictures of him, took some of the greatest pictures I ever took. It was the greatest 4-minute photo shoot I ever did in my life.
How many rolls of film did you burn in 4 minutes?
3 rolls of film in 4 minutes. And I got done and I started packing up my stuff, and Don was on the other side of the room interviewing Keith, and he had just put out a solo album called The Expensive Winos. And he was talking about the fact that he was going out on the road with the band from The Expensive Winos. So I got home, made some prints for the Sun-Times, and I made an extra copy of each one. And I put them in an envelope and wrote a 2-line note to Keith's manager and said, "Hey, heard you guys are going out on the road. Do you need a photographer?" Never heard back. So I just figured it was a good try, you know. I didn't know how to be a tour photographer anyway. Never been on the road with a band, never been on a tour bus before. Day before Thanksgiving, I got a call from her, Keith's manager. She said, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "I was going to my mother's house for Thanksgiving." And she said, "No, you're not. Get up in the morning, pack your bags, fly to Atlanta, come to the Ritz-Carlton, and call me when you get here." And I did that. And then that night I shot the first show of the Expensive Winos tour. And after the show, we got on the tour bus, and I'm on the tour bus with Keith Richards. And we're sitting in the back of the tour bus, hanging out, driving to Memphis. And I did 3 weeks on the road with Keith and the Expensive Winos, who included Waddy Wachtel, who was the guitar player and for every great California band on the planet, Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, all those people. Ivan Neville, Aaron Neville's son, Steve Jordan, who was a great producer. And we drove around the country playing shows, and it was about as good as it gets. So I got done with that. I got home, and there was 3 weeks of mail waiting for me in my front entranceway. And one of the things in the mail was the latest issue of Rolling Stone. And there was a little paragraph in Random Notes that said the Stones, who at that point kind of didn't like each other, were getting back together, and they're recording an album the following year, and they were going to go out on tour in September. So I wrote the same note to the same person, never expecting a response to that. Just saying, "Hey, heard you guys are going out on tour. If you need a photographer, let me know." And that was the Steel Wheels tour. So the tour started, and nothing. And once again, I thought, well, it was a good try. And about a month into it, I got a call from Keith's manager, and she said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'm meeting you. Where am I meeting you?" And she said, "Fly to Boston, get in a cab, come to the Ritz-Carlton, call me when you get here." And that night, I was shooting my first Rolling Stones tour from on stage, my first Rolling Stones show. And after that show, we got in a van, or got in 5 vans, and police escort out of the place to the airport, and we got on a private jet, which of course I'd never been on either, and we ended up that night in Birmingham, Alabama. So Chicago to Boston to Birmingham, Alabama in one day.
Well, the Steel Wheels tour was, if I'm not mistaken, like in rock history, that was the biggest, most elaborate tour that had really ever been undertaken, topped only by the Voodoo Lounge tour a couple of years later. Talk about how you went from Steel Wheels, what you did between that, and then how you got back into it with the Voodoo Lounge tour.
Well, I did 3.5 months on the road with the Stones, and I got home and totally deflated. Like, what do you do after that? And the next week, I got a job, a 2-day job, to go down to Branson, Missouri, and spend 2 days with the entire Osmond family, which was the exact opposite of hanging out with the Rolling Stones. And I just went back to my real life. And then Keith put out another solo album in '93, and they asked me to be on that tour. I did about 2 weeks on that tour. That tour ended on Keith's birthday in New Jersey, December 18th. And the next week there was a note in Rolling Stone saying, hey, you know, they're doing the Voodoo Lounge tour, doing a Voodoo Lounge album and doing a tour. So I sent the same note, and it worked again. And I ended up being, you know, the tour photographer for the Voodoo Lounge tour. And it just kept on going like that.
So it was a few years later, and in the Bridges to Babylon record, and they announced, I don't remember if it was they announced the record or they announced the tour from underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, but they started the tour in Chicago, and it was a few days, maybe even the day before the tour kicked off in Chicago, they played Double Door, and that kind of surprise show.
Well,
but
the first thing they did is they did 3 nights of rehearsals at Soldier Field, and there were helicopters flying overhead, all the news crews were flying around, and everybody wanted to know where they were going to go after the rehearsal was over. And I actually, one of the newspapers in town actually called me every day and said, you know, where are they going to go afterwards? And I said, well, I'll tell you exactly where they're going to go. They're going to go back to the hotel, and they're going to go to sleep. And they didn't believe me, and they sent a writer and a photographer to every blues club in Chicago to sit there until the place closed every night for 3 nights, because they thought, Stones are in Chicago, they're going to go to a blues club, which they never did. So then the day of the 3rd show, we were all hanging around backstage, and they said, hey, you know, we're going to rent out the Double Door. There was a local band that was supposed to play there, and the Stones paid them off. Not paid them off, but like paid them a lot of money to not play. And they took over the place, and they played there. And I rode over from the hotel with the band, and I got out on the sidewalk. The streets were blocked off. Every news crew in Chicago had a crew standing on the sidewalk waiting to see them. I got out of the van with Keith Richards, and we walked across the sidewalk into the club, and there were only 200 people in the club and 1 photographer, and it was pretty darn cool, gotta say.
I remember an iconic picture of the marquee, Rolling Stones, 9 p.m. cover, $7, which I thought was hilarious.
They didn't announce it. They just put it on the marquee at 9 o'clock in the morning. Somebody came out with a bunch of lettering, and they put it on the marquee, and they just waited for something to happen. And somebody was riding their bicycle down the street and saw it and stood in line, and it was right in the beginning of the days of cell phones, and whoever that person was, they were the first person in line, and they got their cell phone out and they called XRT and probably told Lynn, hey, the Stones are playing at the Double Door, and he announced it on the air. And the thing that surprises me the most is that there weren't any accidents, because I figured people were going to be driving 90 miles an hour down Milwaukee Avenue to try to get to the Double Door. And the tickets were only on sale there. They were not on sale anywhere else. You didn't get a ticket, you got a wristband. And your name was put on a list, and you had to show up with the wristband. So you couldn't buy a ticket for somebody else. You could only buy 2 tickets, and you could only get a wristband and then show up with a person with you to get in that night.
Add that to the storied history of Double Door, one of the most iconic rock clubs in the country, and certainly, you can't imagine Chicago rock history without the Double Door, and just to be a part of that, the Rolling Stones equated with Double Door.
And the stage was so small that the backup singers had to stand next to the bar. They couldn't fit on stage. But it was pretty darn cool.
So there's one more tour though that you worked on, or there's been some side projects. What else have you been doing with the Rolling Stones and various members since?
They kind of call me every time they come through town. It's kind of this loose relationship. But a couple years ago, Keith was doing a documentary for his latest solo album, his 3rd solo album, and there's a guy named Morgan Neville who's a film director who won an Academy Award a couple years ago for a movie called 20 Feet from Stardom, which was about, have you seen it? Yeah. It's about backup singers, one of whom is Lisa Fischer, who's up on this wall somewhere. There's a couple pictures of her because she's one of my favorite people. And so he was doing this documentary where he was flying into whatever city the Stones were in, where they had a day off that was a major city, and he'd get in an SUV with Keith, and they'd just drive around the city, and Keith would tell stories about, hey, we used to hang out there, or we used to hang out there. So I met him at the Peninsula, and we drove around for a while. We drove to the Chess Records building. We drove to Muddy Waters' old house, and then we ended up at Buddy Guy's club. And they did about an hour filming of Buddy and Keith playing pool, and the camera went around in circles around the table, and I walked sideways next to the camera taking pictures of them the whole time. And during the hour, neither one of them ever sunk a shot. And I walked up to them afterwards and told them they were the 2 worst pool players I've ever seen in my life. So Keith looks at Buddy and says, well, I'll come back tonight to hang out. So I just hung out there, and I was hanging out with Buddy up in his office. And about 8 o'clock that night, Keith came back, and it was me, Keith, and Buddy, and Keith's manager were the only ones in the room. And I was sitting in between them taking pictures of them. And all of a sudden, Keith turned to Buddy and said, hey, have you met my photographer? And Buddy looked at him and he said, what do you mean your photographer? That's my photographer. And when 2 of the coolest guys on the planet are fighting over you, it's pretty darn cool.
Well, there you have it. Paul Natkin is not done yet.
So we're sitting there talking, and everything's cool, and all of a sudden, a bunch of people start walking into the room, and I look up, and I realize that all 4 members of the Rolling Stones are in the room. And there's about 10 extra people who really didn't belong there. So I look at Keith's manager, and she looks at me. She says, you're a professional. Make it happen. So my only choice was to grab each guy by the arm and drag him out of the room and stick Buddy in between the Stones and take the picture that ended up being, the cool picture of Buddy with the Stones.
It's pretty iconic, and it's a pretty amazing thing to be able to sit down with Paul Natkin in front of a wall of his art, photographs, some of them iconic, many of them XRT listeners know. We've all seen them before. I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk with us on this afternoon in Chicago, Paul.
No problem.
I'm Ryan Arnold from 93 WXRT.